Somebody out there say something just to see if this mic is working.
Good morning.
Good morning. Is that?
Good morning.
Yeah.
I'm going to need some people if you want. I mean, I can read it, but we have a whole lot of Bible verses we're going to look up today. So could I just call out a couple of verses and you guys could be ready at the right time to read some things? Who can do Psalm 24? We hope people are watching at some point during the week here. We're glad to live stream these First Presbyterian classes. We know some of you are just at home, not wanting to be out and about in small spaces because of COVID or because you're at home for other reasons, and others of you are just from wherever you are and you tuned in. So we're glad we're in York, Pennsylvania, on the corner of Queen and Market Street, and we've been doing this Perspectives class for years and years and years. And a couple of years ago, we started doing it hybrid here. So we're glad some of you are at home, wherever you are, and we're glad for the people in the room here. This has been a series we've been doing called Bible Verses That Rock the World. And what it really is individuals who rock the world and how they love the Scriptures or were informed by the Scriptures. With Reformation Day around the corner, we probably should be doing John Calvin, but we started with John Calvin because we're Presbyterians. We looked at Calvin's experiences. We looked at Martin Luther, born in the 1400s. We jumped ahead to some contemporary folks. Alan Bozak from South Africa, who is still alive, wrote the Belhar Confession, which is an official document of the Presbyterian Church USA. His passage was Ephesians, about breaking down dividing walls. We looked at his friend Desmond Tutu, who loved the Old Testament scriptures and the prophets. A couple of weeks ago, we had an evangelism kind of tone, and Stephanie did the Wesley brothers from the 1700s. And then last week, Pastor Kyle talked about Mother Teresa. Died just a couple of years ago, but in most of our memories still. And Mother Teresa's love for the poor. And I think he particularly looked at Matthew 25. How could you not? Matthew 25, what you've done to the least of these, you've done unto me. And Mother Teresa took that quite literally. So we're looking at these individuals wanting to share some of the theology of contemporary and old church leaders and how the Scriptures played into that. So we have several more to go, some surprising, interesting people coming up, men and women they're going to be sharing with you over the next couple of weeks. But today we're doing somebody that is, for me, a tiny bit heart-touching for me because it was an acquaintance of mine, Eugene Peterson. Peterson is known as a Presbyterian pastor who died 4 years ago, I think this week, if I'm getting that right. 4 years ago, Eugene died. He was from Bel Air, Maryland, or not from Bel Air, Maryland, but the church that he took, Christ Our King, was a church he started in his basement, and it grew a bit. It was never a gigantic mega church or anything, as famous as he became with 30-some books and world traveling. He was a humble, quiet guy that just believed in being a pastor. He wrote a memoir a couple of years ago before he died, and it was he wanted to call it Pastor Pete because that's what everybody called him, Pastor Pete. It was just, his book is actually called The Pastor because that's what he wanted to be known as, pastor. In his Bel Air experience, he was teaching Bible lessons, as many pastors do, as Sunday school classes do, and he was fired up. He was a scholar. He was sort of wanting to be a archaeology, Greek and New Testament guy, studied the languages, and he was teaching Galatians and was fired up with his Greek New Testament in front of him. And the people were just sipping their coffee cups in the church basement and just not getting it. They were not caring, they didn't understand. And he determined that there were sort of two things that were keeping people from engaging the scriptures. One is the distance in time and culture and vocabulary and vernacular, that it's just hard to read the Bible, even in a contemporary translation. In those days, the only good contemporary translation was the NIV, which we have in our Pew Bibles here, I think. The New Living was not written yet, translation. And so he realized that the vocabulary and the distance, another was it, is that people just sort of get immune to stuff if they hear it too much in the same old way. And many of these churchgoers just were sort of taking things for granted. So they either knew it too well or they were intimidated by it. They didn't feel like they could understand the Bible, or they understood it too well and didn't get the energy and vision of it all. And so one day he was ready to just close up the whole book, and he said, I'm just going to rewrite it on my own. And he started just getting at his Greek and rewriting, and he mimeographed stuff. That was back in the days of mimeographs. And people came alive. People started reading it. So next week he did the next chapter of Galatians. And then he did another chapter of Galatians, paraphrasing the scriptures the best he could, using the language of Hartford County, Maryland. Clarence Jordan was a famous Baptist preacher that did the cotton patch parables for southern sharecroppers. He lived in Georgia, was a civil rights guy, a white guy, but a civil rights guy, but he called Jesus Rock. And nobody knew what a manger was. What the heck's a manger amongst the southern Appalachian people in northern Georgia? And so he put Jesus in a peach crate because everybody knew what peach crates were. And so he paraphrased and translated the Bible. They called them the Cotton Patch Parables. Well, Peterson did it with sort of suburban, late 20th century lingo set in Hartford County, Maryland. And it took off. And a guy in Red Lion, Pennsylvania, who used to be one of our customers down in Dallastown years and years ago, we opened 40 years ago, knew Eugene and sent some of these to a publisher against Eugene's awareness. And the publisher wanted to publish them, and the rest is history, and it became known as The Message. So Peterson is known as the Bible translator or paraphraser. It's a paraphrase technically, and I assume most people know the difference between a fairly wooden, accurate, literal translation and a more colorful paraphrase. Peterson, interestingly enough, had a whole team of people. It took him years and years and years to do the thing. Had a team of people to help hold him accountable and get it right, and Old Testament scholars and New Testament scholars. And so it wasn't his own baby, but he really was the main writer, unlike most modern translations that are done by teams of people. This was his baby. He thinks, and he's right about this, of course, that nobody translates the Bible literally, or any book literally. In the middle of it, he started to have doubts, and he got 4 different editions of the Odyssey by Homer, and also, I guess it was the Odyssey he got. And he realized that the best ones that the world loved and that the literary critics appreciated were not technically very accurate to the old Greek of Homer. That they were literary. That you can't take one language and translate it into another. Anybody that knows French or German or Russian or Spanish knows that. In English, for instance, we just don't have words for other foreign language words. So you got to take your best guess of how to say a phrase. When it's a 2,000-year-old language or more in Hebrew, it's even harder. Just one quick example, parenthetically. One of the words that is often translated in contemporary translations as homosexuality in Paul is a word that is not used in any other literature anywhere in the Greco-Roman world. Paul made the word up. We don't know how to translate it. The oldest Alexander Pope in the Geneva Bible translated it as soft. It's just a weird word. He kind of put 2 words together, and nobody knows exactly how to render that word into any language, let alone English, that doesn't quite have the nuances of our language. You've heard the old story. I don't even know if it's true, but they say Eskimos have 100 words for snow, and different kinds of white and different kinds of snow, and we have snow. They can't believe we just talk about snow, and they talk about all these different shades or meaning of snow. So translating is tricky. So Peterson actually thinks in his deeply nuanced and colorful and modern colloquial rendition of Greek and Hebrew. He thought he was translating. And he was a little irked and irritated when people said, no, you're paraphrasing. You're adding too much color and you're putting words in that just aren't in the text. He said, yeah, but they're there in their imagination. It's what they mean. And so it's a dynamic equivalence kind of translation. And he's on the far end of very dynamic equivalence as opposed to literal and wooden and accurate in the technical sense. Does that make sense? Well, you probably heard of the message. I met Peterson in the parking lot of our church in the mid-'80s, I'm thinking. He was here at a presbytery meeting, and our church was hosting the presbytery. Because of work or some other commitment, I couldn't even be there, so I didn't hear him. But I wanted to meet this guy. I had read Long Obedience in the Same Direction, which is a book of his that came out in the early 80s. And I wanted to meet him. I knew he was a poet, and I knew he cared about literature, and he cared about novels, and he cared about good books, and he was a solid Presbyterian preacher. The message had not come out yet. He had maybe done that Galatians mimeograph thing in his church, but nobody knew about it yet until the guy sent it into NavPress. So I stood out here in the parking lot and talked to him for like an hour, and we decided we were going to do a poetry reading in our store. He didn't like glitz or fame or any of that sort of stuff, so I knew if I said, could you do a book signing and an autographing thing, he might think that was sort of worldly or something, fame, and he wouldn't want to do that. So I said, how about you come and read some poetry? He has a poetry volume out called Holy Luck, but it had not come out yet. I just knew he wrote poems and Christmas cards and stuff. So I said, why don't you come and just read some poetry? Oh, he thought that was a great idea. Well, then he got sick, and then we had to change something, and then the date changed, and then he moved to Pittsburgh because the message had to be done, and he finally left his church after, 30 years, and he moved to Pittsburgh Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary in East Liberty, Pittsburgh, to finalize the New Testament of the message. He eventually went to the West Coast to become a professor of what they called spiritual theology. He didn't like that phrase, really, but pastoral care and deeper spiritual insights for becoming a pastor in Regent, which is in British Columbia. So what I want to do is I want to tell you a little bit about Peterson's life, very briefly, and then just look up some verses on the message. Have you guys read them in traditional NIV, say, and then I'll read, eventually when we get to it, I'll read the colorful message and just see if you like it or not. I have mixed feelings about it, to be honest. I shouldn't say this publicly. I love most of it. Every now and then I'm like, that just doesn't work. And there's some Psalms I hate, although many people love his renditions of the Psalms. I quit reading it for a while because I just thought it was too clever. And I really didn't like the Psalms. And we have this Bible study on Wednesday nights, a Zoom thing. We're doing Isaiah now. And maybe 3 years ago when we started it, we were doing some stuff, and somebody would read a psalm. And I would say, oh, that's really good. What translation are you reading on Zoom? We have New Living and ESV and the old RSV, And somebody would say, oh, that's the Message. I was like, really? I like that. I thought I didn't like the Message Psalms. Well, then the next week, somebody would read something else, and it would be from the Message. And I was like, that's the Message? Hey, that's good. That makes sense. And pretty soon I started reading the Message again. So let me do what I'd like to start with here, is read some excerpts from a book called A Burning in My Bones by Win Collier. It's the authorized biography. Peterson was dying in his old hometown. He had retired in Montana. Beautiful house, beautiful lake. People would come to visit him. And including Bono, which they made a video of, which I'm going to mention, but the rock star Bono became a fan. Well, since you brought it up, there's a funny story with Bono. Peterson's just, he reads the Bible and he cares for people in a one-on-one way and relationally. He doesn't pay a lot of attention to stuff. And Bono, one of the most famous rock singers in the history of the world, almost like under Elvis, called him, and he didn't take the call. He was like doing something. And later, a couple days later, he was telling a guy who was a youth pastor who was visiting him, some guy named Bono called me. Well, what was that? And the guy said, Bono called you? He goes, yeah, I didn't take his call. I didn't know who he was. The guy, they were hiking. He almost pushed Eugene off the cliff. Because he's like, are you out of here? You're like the only person in the world that would not take a call from Bono. Humanitarian and rock star, they became friends, and they made a little video together of the Psalms in the Message and how Bono liked the Psalms so much. That is, you can find it on YouTube. If you Google Bono and the Psalm and Peterson and the Psalms. It'll come right up. It was done by Fuller Theological Seminary. A guy named David Taylor, who was sort of mentored by Peterson, was the filmmaker. Well, anyway, Dave, before we get to the message, let me just tell you a little bit about this business with Wynne. He, against Eugene and Jan's first instincts, decided there should be a book about him, and he gave all his papers, all his notes, all his letters. He wrote lots of letters. He didn't use emails. He ordered books from us. He was fiercely loyal to our bookstore and would send us faxes at first. Books. It's kind of funny. He didn't have an email, but he had faxes. And would call with his deep voice and order tons of stuff. He was a Wendell Berry fan, so he would order like 6 or 7 of a novel by Wendell Berry called Jayber Crow and say, send it to these 6 pastors who I'm mentoring. And when they read this novel, it's about a farmer. He said, well, anytime they see the barber chair, the guy becomes a barber, tell them to think of their pulpit. And anytime he's describing the fields and the farm, think of their congregation. Just put that note in and send them out to these people. So that was the book he used to mentor pastors. It was Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry, a novel about a farmer.
It's a great book.
It was a great book. So Wynne is the guy that wrote the authorized biography, and it is one of the most amazing books I've read in my life. I've read it twice. I cry through it. I know Peterson a little bit, so it's tender to me, but I think it is for anyone. It's gotten rave reviews. There's a copy or two in our church library. It should be out all the time. It should be the kind of book that somebody borrows from our church library upstairs, and when you come to get it, it's already out. And they should buy another copy because it's so in demand. Really, this is one of the books of the decade, A Burning in My Bones by Wynne Collier. I'm going to read just a little bit about it. Here's what he starts off in the early chapters talking about Eugene being raised. His father was a butcher in a small town in Montana, and his mom was a Pentecostal preacher. And they would go to pretty rough places, lumberjacks, coal miners and stuff, and preach the gospel. So he was raised Pentecostal. He was called a Jesus sissy as a kid and would get beat up by other kids. Loved nature, loved Montana, and sort of stuck with him all his life. Here's what Wynne says. He says, William Blake, the poet, believed that we become what we behold. The words could not be truer with Eugene. This Montana landscape, the place Eugene loved, wondered in, and marveled at his entire life, fashioned him as surely as meltwater carved the basin between the mountains. The breathtaking beauty, immense solitude, and sheer physicality of the valley forged in Eugene a visceral sense of place, an earthiness, to use a word that would become one of his favorites. He traversed deep into his surroundings, spending long days exploring. As a boy, he struck out on his own on Saturdays with boiled eggs and bacon and an occasional biscuit in his pack, looking for Indians and looking for arrowheads, he said. The splendid grandeur of this feral country, with all the wonder and holiness it evoked, nurtured a spiritual imagination in him that was every bit as formative as what he had found in his childhood Pentecostal church. Maybe more. David McCullough, Harry Truman's biographer, explained, if you want to understand Harry Truman, you better know a good deal about Jackson County, Missouri. Likewise, if you want to understand Eugene Peterson, you better know a good deal about Montana's Flathead Valley. Late in his life, as I sat to hear Eugene describe how much time he spent wandering alone under that expanse of sky, it became clear how the land's stark, solitary beauty shaped him, grounding him in a rich silence of soul. As Eugene saw it, to be a boy of Montana stock, birthed out of such grand country and immersed in the lives and history of ordinary, hardworking people who lived close to the land without pretense, was not a mere biographical detail, but an elemental piece of his life. Decades before, he admired the mystics of the early church, Gregory of Nyssa or Ephraim the Syrian, or any of the other great Eastern fathers and mothers of Christianity. Eugene experienced what the Russian Orthodox scholar called the eminence of God, the nearness of God at work in creation. Through his writings, Eugene belligerently resisted the common modern habit of severing earth from heaven, splitting the physical world from the spiritual. These convictions would come to be grounded in deep theology, but were first felt as a boy as he feasted on the infinite Montana sky, inhaled the scent of aspen and Engelmann spruce, and drank crisp water from rushing streams. Montana was Eugene's birthplace, and it became his catechism. Isn't that nice? Isn't that nicely written? The place shaped him. And hence, in his theology, we have a belligerent, constant, cranky, consistent opposition to the splitting of the sacred and the secular, the earth and heaven, what God cares about and what God doesn't care about, beauty and word and world. He brought stuff together like nobody. He says, in this way, Eugene began his life immersed in the reality of what he would call one day the presence. This sense of encounter had an epicenter, 2 acres of holy ground, perched at the edge of Flat Lake's sacred waters, as he called them. This place enveloped Eugene in the vibrant reality of a living, present God. Well, he leaves his Pentecostalism behind, becomes a Presbyterian, goes off to New York to seminary, preaches in a fancy church in New York. He's not a real great preacher. And he ends up in Baltimore, where the Presbyterians have asked him to plant a church. He didn't like bureaucracy. He just, everything about him hated systems and bureaucracy and growth and numbers and efficiency. He just thought the gospel wasn't supposed to be like that. And they would send him papers, stuff he'd have to fill out that he just thought was stupid. I don't think it's in this book, but he told me, and it's in another book, so he wrote about it. He would start writing stupid stuff on the papers to see if the guys in New York or Louisville, I guess it was, were reading it. And he never got called or anything, and pretty soon he started getting weirder. And then it became funny. He started making stuff up. And he started talking about having like drug orgies and stuff, using drugs for communion, LSD. Nobody ever said a word. So maybe Presbyterians were okay with that, but chances are the bureaucracy just wasn't reading his stuff. Here's a little section of the book about his being in Baltimore. But though the call to pastoral ministry was clear, the road from there was anything but. The young pastor quickly realized he was in strange territory. Eugene's supervisor, the Presbyterian leader who brought him to Baltimore, handed Eugene an overstuffed red 3-ring binder filled with instructions on everything one could possibly think of related to forming a new church. The promise of the binder was seductively simple. Whatever problem Eugene might face as a pastor, he need only run his finger down the index and find appropriate instructions: how to organize a committee, how to lay out a church calendar, how to manage a budget, how to implement evangelistic strategies. Small portions may have been helpful, but Eugene noticed how little God had to do. Something elemental had shifted from God, the cross, the resurrection, the living spirit, to finding out what people wanted and then giving it to them. The ink on my ordination papers wasn't even dry before I was being told by experts, so-called, in the field of church, that my main task was to run a church after the manner of my brother and sister Christians who run service stations, grocery stores, corporations, banks, hospitals, financial services. The first year at Christ Our King, Eugene attended a gathering for new church pastors led by a leadership guru who had written a number of best-selling books in church growth. The size of your congregation, the expert explained, will be determined far more by the size of your parking lot than by any biblical text you will ever speak. Eugene eventually gathered the stack of books and tossed them in the dump. Eugene felt alarmed, not only because he sensed in his gut that this approach decentered God, but because so many of these perceived needs were actually destructive and dehumanizing, even antithetical to the good news of the gospel. Eugene, though new to the pastorate, felt himself in the center of a great war. On the one side, the system of the world invoking ancient sins and deadly temptations disguised in a new raiment, advertising, commingled with the intoxication of American security. A soft Christianity using all the right words but missing the profound revolutionary truth. And on the other, the community of Jesus. Small, slow, honest, stumbling forward, suffering. Close to the Christ they sought to follow through the desert of modern life. Nothing could have been more pastorally important than engaging this conflict. As families poured from Baltimore into the suburban comforts of Bel Air, an obsession with safety fueled isolation and a basic compulsive self-centering. The response to fear or insecurity was not community, solidarity, or renewed peacemaking. It was to hunker down, what he thought was the least Christ-like posture available. The bunkers formed by this mentality were certainly metaphorical, but they sometimes became literal, physical extensions of the quiet fear of pandemic. Eugene learned that in response to Sputnik and the panic over a nuclear attack from Russia, a number of his neighbors had excavated bomb shelters in their backyards. Well, this was a major thing for him, whether pastors could just preach Jesus and help people learn to love God by praying and reading the Bible together. Hence this Bible study in Galatians that he did that was not going well. He didn't want church growth. He didn't want seminars. He didn't want bureaucracies. He didn't want big, efficient advertising campaigns to promote a bigger and better church. He just wanted a community of people to learn to love God and each other. He wrote a book called Practicing the Angles, which became very, very important. And it was about spiritual direction, about teaching people to read the Bible and teaching people to pray. It was about his experience actually mentoring a person who was a youth at the time named Jeffrey Wilson. And Jeffrey became the pastor at Westminster Presbyterian right up the street here for a bit. Jeff is a character. He's Roman Catholic now and teaches at a seminary. But for the longest time, he had a little farm in the southern end of York County, and he pastored right here in the city of York. And that book is dedicated to Jeffrey because it was the first time that Eugene actually sort of tried to do pastoral work in the classic historic ways that pastors used to pastor people, instead of being a leader or an entrepreneur, but becoming a pastor. And that book set him on a journey of writing more books about pastoral holiness and meeting together with other pastors to just read the scriptures together and figure out what it would be like. I mentioned that he went out to Regent to become a teacher there. And some people didn't like his classes. He would start with silence, like a lot of silence. And he would stop. He wasn't a man of many words. I've heard him lecture, and he would just stop in the middle and kind of look like he didn't know what, like he'd lost his mind. But he was praying or something, you know. He didn't feel like he had to keep a conversation going like I do. I can't stand a moment of silence. He was really at peace with himself and wanted to give space for God to show up in relationships. Here's just a little excerpt from this wonderful book, I think, by a guy named David Taylor, who went on to make the movie about U2. David Taylor's an artist that had been at Fuller. And he hated personality tests, too, by the way. He said one woman he met with her every week. He never told her to do anything, except at one point he said, you never did one of these Myers-Briggs things, did you? And she said, no. He goes, don't ever do that. So he didn't like putting people in a box. Well, anyway, David Taylor says, he rarely gave us advice. And while he seemed constitutionally allergic to doling out practical advice, he did pray for us. He prayed for us because he believed that that is what we needed most as seminary students, to pray and to be prayed for. Eugene prayed, and Eugene sang. At the beginning of each class for his biblical spirituality course, he passed out lyrics and had everyone sing the hymn, I bind unto myself today, the text from St. Patrick's breastplate. The song had 7 verses and a refrain. David Taylor says, it's truly one of the most complicated melodic pieces of music human beings will ever sing. Chuckling at the memory. It's a gorgeous text, but my goodness. The song was a train wreck over and over again. But every class, Eugene had everyone stand, and David would groan. It was so off-putting. So many words, so hard to sing. It took so long. But after 4 or 5 weeks, David realized what Eugene was doing. By having them sing this laborious hymn, He was not merely teaching them truths, but was drawing them into a life of complicated faith. Eugene was helping us understand that we do theology by praying our theology and by singing our theology. And he wanted to show us how certain practices of prayer demand something from us. This hymn demanded something from us. Certain things like prayer and God cannot be mastered in any quick and immediate way. He tells the story of Julie Canlis, who wrote a major book on Calvin, by the way. And Julie was a prayer warrior and deeply involved in reading the scriptures. She loved the scriptures, and she was a seminary student there at this Regent College in British Columbia. And she went to Peterson for a meeting because she said, I'm just having these doubts and these struggles, and I used to always go to the Bible and I'd find an answer in the Bible, or solace at least, but I don't even want to read the Bible anymore. And you're a Bible guy, you're working on this message thing, you can help me love the Bible again. And Peterson looked at her, turned his back, he went over to his bookshelf, he picked a handful of novels. And he said, put your Bible away, read these, and when you're done, come back and we'll talk again. And realize this immersion in the imaginary world of fiction is maybe what she really needed. He loved the Bible. He thought the Bible was everything. But you don't have to treat it like a fetish, like a magic wand that you just read it and everything, your problems will go away. He knew she didn't need more Bible, she needed more life. She needed to live with these questions that Dostoevsky and these great novelists can get to us. And so he said, read these novels, then we'll talk. Then we'll come back to the Bible. His first book, or famous book at least, was called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. It's a line from Nietzsche, the atheist, so it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke. One of my favorite books came out in 1980. Traveling Light was on Galatians. That was inspired and had these creative paraphrases in it of the book of Galatians. Like in each chapter, he's paraphrasing the text. The Message was not even a word yet. Nobody even knew about it. But the earliest version you'll ever find of what became the Message is in Traveling Light, his study of Galatians. And then he did Run with the Horses in a study of the book of Jeremiah. It's a beautiful book in 1983. In 1993, he did Earth and Altar, which is about the prayers of public life, like political, Psalm 72 and stuff, the Psalms that sort of called us away from self and into community. And so he did this kind of meditation on several of the Psalms. And then he did the New Testament of the Message in 1993 is when that came out. He did the wisdom literature next, he did the prophets, the Pentateuch eventually came out, the historical books, you know, Samuel and Kings and stuff. And the whole Bible was eventually published in 2002. I asked Beth to guess when do you think it out, and she thought, oh, probably the 90s. And he actually finished it in 2002 is when the whole Message came out. Well, I could tell you more about his life and my friendship with him and his role in the church. He has a son that's a novelist. He has a son that's a Presbyterian pastor out on the West Coast. And he has a daughter who's an artist. His wife's named Jan, and she died shortly after he did 4 years ago. I think what we want to do in our remaining time is just give you a flavor of the message. And again, this is not because I love it so much, it's just because it's so very interesting. So let's just read a couple of the message. And if you know this well, I'm sorry, but if you don't know, you might get a kick out of it. I have a parallel here that is the NIV in one column and the message in the other. You can get it like any other Bible. Big, little, leather, hardback, journaling editions, fancy covers, plain covers. Like any Bible, you can get it in all different kinds, but I do commend it. Let me just read Genesis 1 for you. Everybody knows in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. This is how he put Genesis 1. First, this. God created the heavens and the earth. All you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness. God's Spirit brooded like a bird above the watery abyss. Now, if you know Hebrew, he's capturing it well. This isn't just fanciful, poetic whimsy. Maybe some of you have ever heard of the Living Bible, not the New Living Translation, but the old Living Bible was that green thing that was popular in the 70s. That was Ken Taylor. He didn't know Greek. He didn't know Hebrew. He wanted a Bible to talk to his kids. So he said, it's kind of like this. And he would just take a look at the old King James and he'd just wing it. And it wasn't bad for what it was, the Living Bible. But it was not rooted in any knowledge of the text. It was just a guy reading the King James and saying, it's kind of like this. And so the Living Bible became huge. This is not like the Living Bible. He's capturing every phrase of the Hebrew, this ink, this bird, this brooding. So he gets it. But it is so colorful that some people would say, well, those words aren't in the Hebrew. And they're not exactly. So it's a playful, modern, aesthetically rich, nuanced, faithful paraphrase or translation? Paraphrase. We should say it's a paraphrase. He would say it's a translation. Let's just look at a couple of the Psalms. Who has Psalm 24? Could you read that just in the traditional NIV real loud so we can all hear it? Folks at home, this is Psalm 24, 1 to 3.
The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, for he founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. Who may ascend the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place?
Good, thanks. And that's a fairly popular one. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Or as the old King James puts it, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Remember that? Here's how he puts it, just to capture how he does it. God claims earth and everything in it. God claims world and all who live on it. He built it on ocean foundations, laid it out on river girders. That world and ocean and rivers are capitalized, and I'm not sure why, but he's sort of implying the structure of things are God's. God claims earth and everything in it. God claims world and all who live on it. He built it on ocean foundations, laid it on river girders. I don't even know what river girders are. A girder? You think of steel girders, but river girders. Fascinating. Let's read Psalm 36, just to capture how the ordinary NIV puts it. 5 to 9.
Your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies. Your righteousness is like your justice like the great deep. You, Lord, preserve both people and animals. How priceless is your unfailing love, O God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from your river of delights.
Thank you. Thank you. Read that very first sentence again, just the first phrase in verse 5.
Your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies.
Heavens, skies. That's what the Hebrew says. Here's how Peterson puts it. God's love is I can't even say the word now, like a meteor. This is embarrassing. God's love is meteoric.
Meteoric.
Yeah, that's the word. His loyalty is astronomic. His purpose, titanic. His verdicts, oceanic. Yet in his largeness, nothing gets lost. Not a man, not a mouse slips through the cracks. How exquisite your love, O God. How eager we are to run under your wings, to eat our fill at the banquet you spread, as you fill our tanks with Eden spring water. You're a fountain of cascading light, and you open our eyes to light. Work?
I love the NIV, especially the Psalms.
Yeah.
They're so beautiful.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't like his translations if I didn't have that.
Yeah.
But because I do have that,
Then this
I
is
can
fun.
really get into this.
Yeah. I think no one should use the Message exclusively, like just to read it, because it's just a little odd, eccentric maybe is how you might want to put it. But yet, there's something to that. Not a man, not a mouse slips through the cracks.
That's great.
His love is titanic, his verdicts oceanic. Who's got Psalm 116, verse 9? This is an easy one. I think I said I'd read this one, right? Just because it's one verse. If I can find it. 116, verse 9 says this. Well, I'll read the first sentence because it's a poem. You read the context. For you, Lord, have delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before the Lord in the land of the living. You've heard that phrase, the land of the living. It's from Psalm 16. Here's how he paraphrases it. He says, I'm striding in the presence of God, alive in the land of the living. I stayed faithful, though bedeviled, and despite a ton of bad luck, despite giving up on the human race, saying they're all liars and cheaters. I'm striding in the presence of God instead of land of the living in the land of the living. Oh boy. Matthew 5. Let's look at how he does the Sermon on the Mount. 11 and 12 this is.
Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil things against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Famous passage for many of us. God's call to not worry about persecution and so forth. Here's how he puts it. That he's talking about the persecution drives you deeper into God's kingdom. Not only that, count yourself blessed every time somebody puts you down or throws you out or speaks lies about you to discredit me. What it means is that the truth is too close for comfort, and they are uncomfortable. You can be glad when that happens. Give it cheer even. For though they don't like it, I do, all heaven applauds. And know that you are in good company. My prophets and witnesses have gotten into this kind of trouble themselves. They've gotten into this kind of trouble themselves. That makes sense, doesn't it? Give it cheer. That sounds like mid-20th century suburbs. I don't know if we'd say that today. We'd go, who knows what we'd say today? Drop the mic or something.
It's almost like he gives us a small sermon within the scripture
Yeah.
in some ways.
Yeah. Now, did you notice anything that he left out between the NIV and this? All heaven applauds, he says. I kind of like that. But what does the NIV say? Your reward is in heaven. It implies you'll get to go to heaven. You'll inherit the justified life of eternal life, of salvation, is the implication. He just says heaven likes you. I think it's the same thing, but you can see why some, particularly fundamentalists who take the scriptures woodenly, are really mad about this. They'll say this verse is terrible because it takes out the blessing of heaven by just saying heaven applauds. It doesn't say you get into heaven, it just says they applaud. People go ballistic over this verse. I don't think it's that bad. There are a couple where he blew it, I think.
The
And he,
blessed of the poor in spirit to me was so impactful for me. When he translated that, for the first time I felt like I understood it.
wow.
So it's blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. He said, blessed are those who come to the end of their rope, for only then can God rule and reign.
When they come to the end of their rope, then
That
God
to
can
me-
fully reign. Oh,
I just never understood that text until I read in this.
there you go. Thank you. We'll jump ahead to verse 14.
Okay. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden.
Here's how he puts it. Here's another way to put it. You're here to be light, bringing out the God colors of the world.
Wow.
What's it mean to be light? Well, you bring out the God colors of the world. That's curious. I like that. Let's do Romans 3. 28 and 29, Sally.
We maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from observing the law. Is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles too.
Okay. So this is Paul's complicated letter about Jews and Gentiles getting along and salvation through faith alone. I'll tell you what, Sally, read that again, just real loud. Read that again.
For we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from observing the law. Is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles too.
Here's how he puts this. So where does that leave our proud Jewish and this is Paul's Jewish, of course, so he's writing this from Paul. So where does this leave our proud Jewish insider claims and counterclaims? Concealed? Yes. Canceled. What we've learned is this. God does not respond to what we do. We respond to what God does. We finally figured it out. Our lives get in step with God and all others by letting Him set the pace, not by proudly or anxiously trying to run the parade. Now that goes down to verse 28. That's 28. And then verse 29. And where does that leave our proud Jewish claim of having a corner on God? Also canceled. God is the God of outsider non-Jews as well as insider Jews. How could it be otherwise? I like that he mentions insiders and outsiders. Like, I kind of get that. That's very modern language. That the Jews themselves thought they had the corner on God. He says the corner on God. That's helpful to me. Oh, these Jews think they've got the corner of God. They think they have him in his pocket. And they're insiders to all this. Well, what happens when outsiders start getting in? There's some conflict there. And this is setting the stage for all the conflict. Romans 8:28 is a fun one to look at. I can't close. We're running out of time. I got to read amongst my favorite passages of Scripture. Includes Romans 12:1 and 2. Let me just read you this in the more traditional NIV. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. The more traditional translations even say this is your spiritual worship, is how the King James puts it. But do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. That's the NIV, a modern language translation, but traditional. Here's how Peterson puts it. I love this. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take everyday, ordinary life. You're sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit in without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to maturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. Now, that's colorful. You're walking around every day, going to work life. I get that. He also, in the traditional language, says that we're supposed to be a witness. We're going to prove to the world what the good is. And I think he misses that. Unlike the culture around you dragging you down, this will bring out the best in you, developing well-formed maturity. But it leaves out the bit that is showing to the world how to live. He misses that, it seems to me. But I still love his rendering of that. Well, geesh. In Galatians 3, verse 1, he says, "You crazy Galatians." Has someone put a hex on you, he says? I think that hex sounds central Pennsylvania and northern Maryland. Most people don't say hex, they would say a spell. But he said a hex. And it's because he's capturing the colloquial lingo of us. Read Colossians 1. It's one of my favorite. Read Ephesians 2. He does a really nice job with that. He wrote a book on Revelation. It was the hardest book he wrote. He wrote a book on prayer using the Psalms, which was beautiful. He wrote several books on pastoral theology. He wrote a little small book of what happened to Jesus after the resurrection. 3 things that happened after the resurrection. Eating meals together, developing friendships. He has one serious commentary on one book of the Bible, Samuel. His book on the life of David, that's pretty neat. He's a great writer. He's a poet. He reads serious novels. He read serious novels. But he's known for the message. Critics have suggested he leaves key things out, and if you read Google criticisms of the message, there'll be word comparisons where he misses things or adds too much. Fair enough. He wrote to people vociferously. He would answer everybody that wrote to him. And people were mean. People wrote ugly stuff. And he was gracious. His years back in Montana were mostly mentoring people that would come to him, pastors, leaders, that would come for days at a time, and he would let them come, or not, and they would just hang out by the lake. He loved to kayak. He was a bird watcher, going back to that early part of him as a boy traveling through Montana. He did that a lot. His son Eric made a handmade casket. His dad had taught him woodworking, pine casket, and a cradle that they had made as a child was in his funeral. The funeral's online. You can watch it. Leaf is the poet, and Eric is the son who was the Presbyterian pastor. Good family, good people. The message is one person who rocked the world. They've sold millions of copies, and it's helped the Bible come alive for a lot of people. So I think it fit, even though it's a very contemporary figure, it fit to add to this class. So thanks. And get this from the church library. It's awesome. Folks at home, thanks a million.